Up next is Charlotte McElvaney, and she'll be discussing dental cultural identifiers and populations from across Alaska and Siberia.
Charlotte, I just made you co-host. Okay, you're there. Great.
So yeah, thank you. And thank you to the association, the scholarship committee, the tribes and the descendants of the ancestors we'll be looking at, and everyone for listening. We'll be looking at dental cultural identifiers from populations across Alaska and Siberia. The aims of the study were to establish the presence of any dental cultural identifiers which may have occurred in Siberian and Alaskan populations. If cultural identifiers were found, assess the different types of identifiers and how they varied across populations, and evaluate the demographic distribution of the cultural identifiers, and evaluate the frequency that they occurred, and also of the odontological alterations. There has been studies at Siberia, St. Lawrence Island, Aleutian Islands, Kodiak Island, and Alaska. We'll be going over what cultural identifiers are, the types we'll be looking at here, the populations we'll be including, how we'll be looking at the cultural identifiers, what we found, and what it means. So what are cultural identifiers? When bioarchaeologists analyze them, they are permanent alterations to the body, either skeletal, dental, or on the soft tissue. The reasons behind cultural identifiers is to present a message or convey a meaning. They have different meanings which are culturally specific. So one population's practice may look like another, but the two can convey a completely different meaning. They can show affiliation, socio-economic status, reaching social achievements, or be for beautification purposes. Within archaeological, most ethnographic studies, they are mostly associated with positive connotations, but we know sometimes they aren't, such as with prison tattoos. Cultural identifiers can be conducted on subadults, and when they are normally performed on parts of the body which are still growing, as they can have their form shaped and altered. It's artificial cranial modifications, where the cranial bowl is shaped, but they are mostly associated with adults. A problem with cultural identifiers is that researchers frequently rely on ethnographic accounts and ethnographic studies which are conducted on contemporary populations to infer what is being practiced on archaeological populations. Why this is a problem is that contemporary populations may not practice the same cultural expressions as the archaeological populations. This happens frequently in that populations where a large number of studies are being conducted, such as South American populations or African populations, are used as a proxy for a population from another part of the world. A further problem with relying on ethnographic accounts is that it becomes hard to find independent evidence of cultural identifiers, because without similarities to ethnographic accounts, it just becomes difficult to prove. There's been a lot of work on cultural identifiers from different parts of the world, cultures and time periods, but not all parts of the world have been studied, which includes Alaska and Siberia. There have been a lot of focus on South American populations in relation to dental inlays and filing, and in African populations where ablation and lip plates are focused on. Just as how there are discrepancies in parts of the world and time periods where cultural identifiers have been studied, so too are there discrepancies in the types of cultural identifiers being studied, with focus on ablations as well as dental shaping and enamel inlays. Much less work has been conducted on labrates, and even less work has been done on the effects of wearing labrates. Cultural identifiers to the soft tissue, such as tattoos, are difficult to analyze, as even when soft tissue preserves, the tattoos may not. So bioarchaeologists largely focus on skeletal and dental cultural identifiers, and ablation and labrates are the two we are focusing on today. So labrates are pieces of jewelry, normally a plug worn just above or below the lips or through the cheeks. They're worn by creating an incision into the soft tissue with the labret being placed in between. They're found in archaeological record because the material normally preserves. They also found in material cultural items, which depicts people wearing them. In ethnographic accounts of contemporary populations, often tease themselves in the presence of a facet. The facet is the odontological alteration which occurs, and this is a shiny flat surface, and is caused by someone continuously rubbing against it. Sometimes the labret can alter the entire shape of the dental arc, but this is not been recorded in the areas we're looking at that has been found in the Pacific Northwest. Ablation, meanwhile, is the intentional removal of teeth for non-medical reasons, more likely to occur on the anterior teeth, the incisors and canines, less commonly on the premolars and rarely the molars. There are different ablation methods, such as the teeth being pulled out, or more traumatic forms where the teeth are knocked out, and this can cause trauma to the alveolar bone. Within ethnographic and bioarchaeological studies, ablation is normally considered to be conducted with symmetry present, normally on the left and right side of the same jaw, but this isn't always the case. Ablation can be conducted asymmetrically with different teeth ablated at different times. This can be hard to recognize as the teeth are moved at different periods of a birth and life, but they live long enough for alveolar bone to heal completely, then both would be scored as antemortem tooth loss, and we wouldn't see the different times they were lost. In studying ablation, we need to rule out other pathologies which cause tooth loss, such as caries, periodontitis, and wear. Problem with researching both these cultural identifiers is the scoring system. There's currently no way of recording or scoring evidence of labrets on dental remains, and recording ablation is based on the pattern of antemortem tooth loss, and it's easier to establish as already reported on the population. Big difference between the two is ablation is analysed directly on the remains, whilst labrets are inferred from alterations that occur. There are very few publications on the effects of wearing labrets, especially in the populations we're looking at. We do find slightly more research from the Pacific Northwest area, but we're only going to concentrate on the references to labrets and ablations in the populations here. There are a lot more information on labrets themselves from ethnographic accounts and material cultural objects and archaeological literature. As you can see, there's very few references to the effects of wearing labrets. I found 2, but the information in the published literature was limited to what's on the slide. While work has been conducted on these populations, labrets have been associated with human-animal transfigurement or as displays for withstanding pain from the insertion of the labret. And as was recorded for Kodiak Islanders, labrets were also worn from near birth. There has been more recent clinical research on the effects of labrets which are associated with alveolar bone resorption. The problem is modern labrets demonstrate rings or studs, not plugs, which is largely what's found in archaeological records, so the clinical data may not provide comparative data for these populations. An important point is that in all references to the populations here, all labrets were worn on the lower lip, which would affect mandibular teeth. For ablation, there is even less research for the areas we're studying, but there are 3 very important and frequently referenced pieces of work which are by Hudlischka, Merbs, and Cook. Overall, is that the view is that ablation is not practiced in the Arctic or subarctic populations. This is mostly based on Merb's work, whose research was aimed at rejecting the proposal by Hudlischka, who was the first to analyze ablation in the Alaskan and Siberian populations. Hudlischka found evidence of ablation in Alaskan, but not Siberian skeletal remains, were a mixture of crania, mandibles, and complete skulls. Stated this was practiced only on adult individuals. We had no age categories other than adult and subadult, so this is difficult to reanalyze. He also found a traumatic form of ablation. I've rejected ablation as occurring in Arctic or subarctic populations because the teeth is so important for use of tools, which is sometimes turned to paramasticatory dental activities. There are some problems in Merbs' work. Population usually from Southampton Island in eastern Canada and was culturally distinct from those studied by Hudlischka. So they would have practiced different forms of cultural expression. For Siberia, Canada, and Greenland, there does not seem to be any cultural identifiers relating to the teeth. This is based on lack of labrets in the archaeological record, material culture, or then ethnographic accounts. Rather, these populations are associated with tattoos as a form of cultural identifier. Also, Merbs live in ethnographic accounts from African populations state asymmetrical ablation did not occur, and recovered populations from different areas, time periods, and cultures should not be used as a proxy, particularly between African and North American populations, because they're so different. So it should be expected that Merbs' population did not display ablation. And finally, Merbs didn't publish his results, just the interpretations, they're impossible to reanalyze. The final studies by Cook, who analyzed the same population from Kodiak Island as Hudlischka, and found ablation this time also in subadults. Cook also found evidence of traumatic removal of teeth, which resulted in the roots being retained. And the last 2 references concern the same individuals from South Alaska, but relate to an unusual form of ablation, which is post-mortem removal of teeth after the person has died, and they're found in another portion of the site, which is really interesting and distinct in the bioarchaeological and ethnographic literature. So for this study, several methods were used. Where possible, methods for age and sex estimation developed on populations similar to those here were used to score for other conditions which may cause antemortem tooth loss. The methods were Hilson, which scores for tooth presence and caries, Brabant for wear, and Ogden for periodontal disease. Hilson was also used for ablation as a score for antemortem tooth loss. Had to add a score for Hilson to capture data I was finding, which was where the crown of the tooth was lost antemortem, but roots were found in the socket with or without alveolar bone remodeling. So there's no method to score or record the presence of labrets on the dentitions relied on the presence of facets in the buccal aspect. This is the portion of the tooth facing the cheek and lips. There are no logical activities which would generate a facet in the buccal labrets. Labrets could be designed and premolars were removed from the study because they have very unreliable eruptions of presence, and this can confuse ante-mortem tooth loss scores. There were 4 populations, all of them from unknown archaeological context. This means they do not have any known cultural affiliations or dates associated with them, but are believed to be pre-European contact. Some individuals have very precise locations where they are found, others simply are labeled Aleutians or similar. Largely, these populations are composed of crania, but some had mandibular veins and some were complete skulls. This is because they were historically collected, and during this time period, focus was on the number of individuals and less so any archaeological context. Very rarely do you get post-cranial remains. When you do, they're clearly a teaching collection, so just long bones. The population includes adults as well as males and females from multiple age categories. So because these sites have an unknown archaeological contact, they've all been pooled into the 4 populations. Pooling data does mean you lose any temporal distinctions, but with smaller populations, we pool data anyway. And as these all lack temporal distinctions, the only option was to pool them. The individuals were created at 2 institutions, the American Museum of Natural History and the Canadian Museum of History. I liaised directly with the museums in both instances, with the Canadian Museum of History contacting tribal leaders in the area, where the individuals were found to inform them that the museum created the individuals and that a researcher had requested access to them. So although I myself did not speak with tribal representatives and communication was limited, I'd like to thank all the communities in this area we'll be looking at. I hope everyone here finds research interesting and it helps recreate the cultural identities of the populations we're looking at. The Amnak Island population has the most information available on them. The information did not cover all individuals, but several had information relating to which part of the island they were found in and material cultural items associated with them, which included labrets. The individuals with information were all found in middens and not always near any postcranial remains. This doesn't necessarily mean the skulls were removed and buried in the midden. This could have been from taphonomic processes. The Aleutian Islanders are known to wear labrets based on ethnographic accounts and evidence from archaeological and biological record. The St. Lawrence population included the Cape Chaplina remains in Siberia, and because of the proximity between the 2, they've been merged. Found no references to Siberian or St. Lawrence Islanders wearing labrets or being found in the archaeological record, but there is evidence of tattoos from material cultural and ethnographic accounts. South Alaskan population is composed of mainland Alaskan and Kodiak Islanders. The mainland Alaskan individuals are from around the surrounding areas of Kodiak Island. These populations are known to practice artificial cranial modifications and wear labrets. Whilst the West Aleutian population is composed of individuals from known Aleutian sites and unknown sites, this is very much a merged population, and I merged a lot of individuals from around the Aleutian Islands, but the population is quite small, so if I hadn't, then I would have had more populations of only 1 or 2 individuals in. So the results, I hope the slide isn't too table heavy. Caries were very infrequent, which is normal for Arctic and subarctic populations, as their diets largely lacked cariogenic material. When in the Amnak Island presented these caries mainly on females or in the old age class. Many more individuals presented ante-mortem tooth loss than caries. Periodontoses were similar across all populations, age classes, and tooth classes, where it was the most extensive in Amnak Island and West Aleutian populations, with lesser in St. Lawrence, followed by the South Alaskan population. So caries, periodontitis, and wear, which could lead to ante-mortem tooth loss, were excluded as etiologies of the ante-mortem tooth loss found. Only in the Amnak Island population displayed facets or maxillary with different locations between the females and males, both of whom were old adults. Females displayed facets on the lateral incisors and canines, and the male on the central incisors. For ablation, ante-mortem tooth loss in the Amnak Island was not found in the young adults, only in mature adults, and roots remaining were only found in males, mostly on the mandibular dentition. Where roots retained, they were just below at the level of the alveolar bone. There was no alveolar trauma present, but 1 instance where roots were found with healing alveolar bone to the socket. South Alaska population had a really good mean of tooth presence with faint traces of a pattern of ante-mortem tooth loss. The St. Lawrence population had no mandibles apart from a single second molar, but the anterior tooth loss was less similar to the molar ante-mortem tooth loss, where we do not find ablation because they're hidden by the cheeks. So I feel fairly confident this is a normal level of ante-mortem tooth loss for this population. The West Aleutians had high rates of anti-morphine tooth loss, but this is because the number of teeth present was so small, and similar to the St. Lawrence population, the molar teeth also showed anti-morphine tooth loss. It was around the same number of percentage of anterior teeth, so really no evidence of ablation. So how did I interpret the results? Well, the Ammonite Island population was found to have two types of cultural identifiers, each type with variation between males and females, and the placement of elaborates and abstraction methods in ablation practices. However, all in older individuals, female had laterally placed elaborates with no traumatic ablation, males had centrally placed elaborates and traumatic ablation. Could not find any evidence of transfigurement, but that's very based on conjecture, in my opinion. So Lawrence population, which contained no evidence of cultural identifiers, it conforms to everything we know about cultural identifiers in this population, but given the population here is quite small, it may have been affected by the lack of mandibles. Also, given how close they were to the Alaskan populations who did have cultural identifiers, they likely practiced a different form of cultural identification. South Alaska population, where elaborates have been found, only showed tentative results of ablation with slightly elevated levels of anti-morphine tooth loss. There's a study here could not confirm if ablation had been conducted, nor find bioarchaeological evidence in elaborates. In the West Aleutians populations, it did not show evidence of any cultural identifiers, so they may have practiced another form of cultural identification. Populations composed of individuals from multiple areas across West Aleutians, so any cultural identifiers may have been lost in this combination. To conclude, first, we found the Ammonite Island population was multi-stratified with two cultural identifiers showing at least 3 social stratum, 2 with cultural identifiers, 1 without. This found directly on the human remains independent of ethnographic accounts, which may or may not represent the archaeological population or culture being studied. Found evidence of ablation being practiced in the Ammonite Island population, with males showing a traumatic form which conformed to Adlishka, whilst females did not display the traumatic form. This is parallel to evidence of elaborates where females and males showed different placements of elaborates. We've also found evidence of a distinct and unrecorded form of cultural identifier, which was maxillary placed elaborates. There did not appear to be any post-mortem ablation, only a few individuals presented facets, but as little work has been conducted on the effects around elaborates, it is unknown if this number is within the normal range of frequency. South Alaska population needs a bigger MNI, and there's no evidence of cultural identifiers in the St. Lawrence or West Aleutian populations. West Aleutian populations. The study could be improved by radiograph to assess the prevalence of roots remaining and studying individuals from known archaeological contexts. So we know the dates and try to place them in known or unknown cultures. Analysis of mummified remains have showed the insertions into the soft tissue, so we can look for elaborate prevalence alongside what is recorded on the teeth, as well as soft tissue cultural identifiers like tattoos. Finally, as there keeps being analysis showing ablation, this being the third, there needs to be a re-evaluation of ablation being practiced in Arctic and subarctic populations. So,
All right. Thank you, Charlotte.
okay. Sorry, that was a bit of a rush. I was very nervous, so hopefully it all made sense.
Sure. Yeah, we've got a couple minutes. If anybody has questions or comments for Charlotte or Nick, even assuming Nick's still in the room with us. Oh, yeah, I think he is.
Still here.
So I have a question for Charlotte. This is Monty Rogers here.
Hello.
Interesting research, and part of what I found interesting was the consultation efforts, as far as you reaching out to the museums and reaching out to tribes.
Mm-hmm.
What was some of the feedback that tribes provided on this research?
So yeah, the museum, the Canadian Museum of History, excuse me, I do not believe had contacted the tribes before I inquired about accessing the remains. So they decided to write letters to all the tribal leaders in the area, and they reached out to names Amy from Kodiak Island Museum, they needed help finding the tribes. And they wrote letters to them saying, please, someone's interested in them, in studying them, we have access to them. And if we don't hear back to you within 5 months, we will okay her research. And no one got back to them. So there wasn't any consultation, it was exceptionally limited. But when I started doing research, I decided to go along with the museums. I didn't think it would be appropriate or right for me to just approach random people saying, I'm going to a museum and I think they have remains of your ancestors there. So I thought I would, for each of the museums, I would just follow their lead and then be open and honest with my research. It did result in several tribes being contacted, which up to this point they hadn't. And I don't know if they've made any contact since. I mean, in the last 12 months, a lot of other stuff has happened in the world, so I'm not sure if that's hindered anything, but no, that I know of, no other contact other than the letters was made.
Gotcha. Are you planning any reaching out to the communities after you've completed your research to share it?
Yeah, I need to, because when I finish, I submit my work to each of the institutions, and then I'll be able to say to them, this is what I found, and so this is what I'm planning on doing it, whether it's doing more research, but it'll definitely be going out and reaching out, being like, is this something you're interested in? Because I can always deposit a copy of my research with them. It's basically just a PDF. And so, yeah, trying to find out more about what they would like to do. But yeah, just for now, I've only been interacting with the museums. And then this is me slowly beginning to do outreach for my work.
Well, that's all very interesting.